On May 11, 2022, 25-year-old Anna Mariah Wilson was found murdered on the floor of a friend's home in Austin, Texas. The professional cyclist had been fatally shot just days before she was set to compete in a cycling race. Before long, authorities began to suspect that a 34-year-old yoga instructor named Caitlin Armstrong was responsible. Armstrong, who was in an on-again, off-again relationship with a man named Colin Strickland, was furious to learn that Strickland had briefly dated Wilson during a break in the relationship. And as it turned out, Strickland and Wilson had met up earlier on the day that Wilson was killed. Following forensic clues and damning statements from people who knew Armstrong, authorities closed in on her, and soon resorted to unusual tactics after she fled to Costa Rica and tried to start a new life. Caitlin Marie Armstrong was born on November 21, 1987, and grew up in Livonia, Michigan. Her parents divorced when she was a child, and her mother later struggled with alcoholism. According to a childhood friend, Armstrong was also the victim of sexual violence as a child. Armstrong graduated from high school in 2005 and then attended Eastern Michigan University. She eventually became a licensed realtor, though her biggest passion was teaching yoga. In 2018, Armstrong even attended a 4-week yoga teacher training course in Bali, Indonesia. According to other attendees, Armstrong appeared to be a bit reserved. You could tell that some people weren't really happy with their current situation back at home, and she was one of them. One anonymous attendee stated in an interview. At one point during the trip, the attendee claimed that Armstrong overreacted to a minor allergic reaction in the middle of a group dinner. She had some sort of minor panic attack because she was having a small allergic reaction to some of the food. She really overreacted, they stated. Many at the retreat likely saw Armstrong as a reclusive and highly anxious person who didn't care much to mingle with other people. However, none of them could have guessed that she would be capable of murder. Anna Mariah Wilson was born on May 18, 1996, in Littleton, New Hampshire. Raised in Vermont, Wilson seemed destined to become an impressive athlete. She regularly cycled and skied with her family members, and she eventually went on to become a nationally ranked junior skier. While attending Dartmouth College, Wilson majored in engineering and participated in the university's alpine ski racing team. After she graduated, she worked as a demand planner for a bicycle manufacturer before entering the world of professional cycling. Wilson quickly excelled. Amazingly, at the 2022 Sea Otter Classic, Wilson won the Fuego 80K race, beating out an Olympic cyclist and countless other talented athletes. The win earned Wilson a spot in the remainder of the Lifetime Grand Prix series, a total of 7 races culminating in a $250,000 grand prize for the winner. After the Sea Otter Classic, Wilson prepared to compete in the 200-mile unbound gravel race in Kansas, the second race of the series. Naturally, her rising star in the cycling community had led to new connections and relationships. And at some point back in 2021, Wilson had met Colin Strickland, another competitive cyclist. Bonding over their shared love for cycling, Strickland and Wilson eventually began seeing each other. And while it may have seemed like an exciting start to a new relationship, a threat loomed just around the corner. As it turned out, Strickland had recently separated from his girlfriend Caitlin Armstrong, whom he had shared an on-again, off-again relationship with since 2019. And though Strickland's romance with Wilson was reportedly brief, it was apparently more than the yoga instructor could handle. On the night of May 11, 2022, a woman named Caitlin Cash called authorities to report that she had found her friend unresponsive and lying in a pool of blood in her bathroom at her home in Austin, Texas. At the gruesome scene, authorities identified that unresponsive friend as Mariah Wilson. It was later learned that Wilson was temporarily staying with Cash in Austin for the 150-mile Gravel Locos race. Less than an hour before 10 p.m. that night, an intruder had apparently entered Cash's home and fatally shot Wilson 3 times. A neighbor's Ring camera captured audio of Wilson screaming as the gunshots went off. Immediately, investigators reviewed surveillance footage from a neighbor's home. The camera pointed toward the street, and investigators wondered if it could have captured the suspect approaching the home. Although the footage did not show the perpetrators sneaking up to the residence or scaling the home's walls, it did capture a black Jeep with a bike rack driving by shortly after Wilson was dropped off at Cash's home. Authorities began their investigation by asking Cash about Wilson's routine that day. Cash told police that Wilson had spent the day with Colin Strickland, so investigators reached out to him for an interview. At the time, Strickland was living with Armstrong, and when investigators went to the couple's home in Austin to interview them, they noticed a black Jeep with a bike rack in the driveway that looked identical to the one seen in the surveillance footage of Wilson returning to Cash's home. Investigators also gathered other evidence at the Strickland-Armstrong home, including 2 firearms, one of which was later linked to spent casing found at the crime scene. Meanwhile, Strickland opened up about his relationship with Armstrong and his prior romance with Wilson, whom he claimed he only shared a platonic and professional relationship with now. Though authorities were initially most interested in Strickland, it didn't take long before they shifted gears to focus on Armstrong instead. Aside from physical evidence, authorities eventually received worrying statements from people who knew Caitlin Armstrong. Reportedly, Armstrong had made disturbing statements to her friends, claiming that if any woman tried to date Strickland, she would kill her. When her friends dismissed her threats, she allegedly said she was serious. "No, you don't understand. I bought a gun." During Strickland's interview with police, he told investigators that Armstrong was a very jealous woman, and when he remained in contact with Wilson, his former fling, he had to tiptoe around his girlfriend. Armstrong reportedly monitored Strickland's phone closely to keep tabs on his conversations with Wilson, and even contacted Wilson herself on multiple occasions, warning her to stay away from Strickland. Despite this, Strickland continued to maintain his friendship with Wilson and fatefully met up with her on the day of her murder. That day, Strickland went for a swim with Wilson and ate a meal at a restaurant with her. During their hangout, he purposely ignored Armstrong's calls, telling her later that his phone died. It was later learned that Armstrong knew this was a lie, as she had secretly followed the pair that day. She couldn't get over the fact that Colin and Mariah were still in contact with each other. Austin Police Detective Richard Speitler stated, "It was shocking the amount of evidence we were able to get on Caitlin." On May 12, 2022, police used Armstrong's old outstanding warrant for failing to pay for a Botox treatment to ask her about Wilson's murder. Armstrong was reportedly quiet and uncooperative throughout the entire interrogation, and repeatedly told investigators, "I would like to leave." "There was no emotion at all," Spittler said. "We are telling her that her car is at the scene of this murder, and she just nods her head. She doesn't even try to deny it." However, since Armstrong wasn't officially a suspect yet, and her old arrest warrant had an incorrect birth date, she was released. On May 17, 2022, police were finally able to issue a homicide warrant for Armstrong, following the ballistics report confirming that Armstrong's gun was most likely the same gun used to kill Wilson. However, when authorities showed up to arrest Armstrong, they discovered that she had already fled. On May 14, 2022, Caitlin Armstrong left Austin, Texas, shortly after selling her Jeep. She first flew to New York, where she briefly met up with her sister. While in New York, she stole her sister's passport and booked a May 18th flight from Newark, New Jersey to San Jose, Costa Rica. After her arrival in Costa Rica, she underwent plastic surgery in an attempt to change her appearance and dyed her hair. But she apparently remained passionate as ever about yoga, as she also tried to set up a yoga teaching business. She eventually made her way to a hostel in Santa Teresa Beach in Provincia de Punta Arenas, in an apparent attempt to start a new life. Back in the United States, authorities viewed footage of Caitlin Armstrong at the airports she flew out of, but they could not figure out her final destination. They searched San Jose, but could find no sign of her there. U.S. Marshals ultimately discovered her probable location after putting out fake advertisements looking for yoga instructors. A person believed to be Armstrong responded to one of those ads, proving to be a valuable clue. Agents determined that she had likely traveled to Santa Teresa Beach and was possibly staying at a hostel called Don John's. But finding her wouldn't be easy. In Santa Teresa, there were a lot of tourists, and a lot of young women who happened to look similar to Armstrong. And to make matters more complicated, many of these women were also taking yoga classes. To track Armstrong down, authorities resorted to unusual tactics. One female agent ended up taking 3 different yoga classes in the area in the hopes of finding her, while other officers befriended locals, convincing them to send photos that may have had Armstrong in the background. In fact, people had seen Armstrong at local spots in Santa Teresa, but they didn't realize who she was. Armstrong was hiding in plain sight using different names, Deputy U.S. Marshal Damian Fernandez later said. But it took another Deputy U.S. Marshal, Emir Perez, posing as a Mexican tourist to finally locate Armstrong. After spotting the young woman at a patio at Don John's, Perez asked her about the place in Spanish, taking a close look at her as she used Google Translate to respond to him. He then told his fellow agents, 100%, that's her. She's in there. By the time she was finally arrested, she'd been on the run for 43 days. While awaiting her trial, Caitlin Armstrong attempted to flee again during a medical appointment on October 12, 2023. But she was unsuccessful. During her trial, the prosecution outlined how Armstrong committed the murder on the night of May 11, 2022, claiming that she used a fitness app to track Moriah Wilson's movements while she was staying in Austin. She had downloaded and saved photos of Moriah on her phone, Detective Spittler stated. Based on the GPS data from the fitness app Strava, she was able to see exactly where Moriah was staying by viewing her bike rides. She was stalking Moriah hours before the murder. Along with Strava data, Armstrong likely also kept tabs on Wilson via social media. Considering how closely she was monitoring Strickland's phone, she probably picked up clues from there about where the two would be, so she could follow them and sneak up on Wilson after she was alone. After an emotional trial, Armstrong was convicted of murder on November 16, 2023. She was sentenced to 90 years in prison, and she is currently attempting to get a new trial and a notice of appeal. In June 2024, Armstrong was ordered to pay $15 million to the family of Wilson following a wrongful death lawsuit. As for how the Wilson family is managing the loss, they try to remember the goodness of their beloved family member amidst their emotional pain and grief. Moriah Wilson's grieving brother Matt Wilson said, "My sister had her life taken from her. For no reason at all. She'll never ride a bike again. She'll never take a 20-minute break from work to bake banana bread in her kitchen. She'll never get married." And her mother Karen Wilson said, "She had power in her. She lived every day as if it was her last." Barbara Kuklinski knew her volatile husband had a dark side. What she didn't know was that her husband, Richard, the father of her 3 children, lived a life more incredible than anything seen on The Sopranos. He frequently beat her and had even broken her nose on multiple occasions. But she didn't know that he'd purportedly murdered 65 people before they met, and that he'd go on to kill many more. Indeed, Richard Kuklinski was an alleged mafia hitman known as the Iceman. Though he was eventually convicted of just 5 murders, Richard later claimed that he'd killed as many as 200 people. His arrest in 1986 came as a surprise to Barbara, who'd spent the last 25 years raising their 3 children alongside him in suburban New Jersey. But it wasn't a complete shock. When detectives told her what Richard was accused of, everything suddenly made sense. All of a sudden, it was like, "I knew that," Barbara later remarked. "I knew he was a murderer." Barbara Kuklinski met Richard Kuklinski in 1961 when she was just 18 years old. Barbara was fresh out of high school and working as a secretary at a New Jersey trucking company, where Richard, married and 7 years her senior, had a job at the loading dock. Richard pursued Barbara intensely. After their first date, he gave her flowers and a gift and invited her to a second one. Before long, he would wait for her after work every evening with flowers. But Barbara wasn't sure she was ready to commit to one person. "He was obsessed with me," she stated. He would say over and over again, "I love you, lady." I would just say, "Me too." I never loved him, and I never told him I loved him. One day, as they sat in his car, Barbara told Richard that she wanted to see other people. Richard exploded. He jabbed her in the back with a hunting knife, deep enough to draw blood, told her that she belonged to him, threatened to murder her entire family, and choked her until she passed out. Richard apologized the next day. He blamed his outburst on his intensity of feeling and told Barbara he wanted to marry her. Reluctantly, she agreed. By the time they married, Richard Kuklinski had allegedly already committed 65 murders. By his own account, Richard Kuklinski had already killed dozens of people by the time he first asked Barbara on a date. His violent crimes purportedly started in childhood, when he claimed he beat the town bully to death at the age of 14. In the 1950s, while working in a film lab, Richard started covertly bootlegging movies after work, and soon broke into the bootleg porn industry. This line of business introduced him to a number of seedy characters, and before long, the 6'5" Richard, who weighed about 300 pounds, allegedly got involved with the mafia. He started by working with mobster Roy DeMeo of the Gambino crime family, trafficking illegal pornography, administering beatings, and other tasks. According to Philip Carlo's biography of Richard Kuklinski, The Iceman, Confessions of a Mafia Contract Killer, when DeMeo learned that Richard had done some special work for the DeCavalcanti crime family, he recruited him as a hitman for the Gambino family. Richard would allegedly go on to work for all 5 New York crime families, as well as 2 New Jersey families. Not only did Richard obey his official orders, but he also purportedly carried out murders of his own. He began to prowl the Upper West Side of New York City, where he claimed he'd target people who annoyed him or who had slighted him somehow. His methods were varied. Richard shot, stabbed, strangled, poisoned, or bludgeoned his victims. And along the way, Richard Kuklinski also concocted an ingenious way to throw the police off his scent, by leaving the bodies of his victims in industrial freezers for months or even years. Then, once investigators found the remains, they would have difficulty determining when exactly the victim had died. This technique earned Richard the nickname the Iceman. But to Barbara Kuklinski, he was her husband, someone who returned to her each night at their home in suburban New Jersey. And he quickly became someone to fear. Barbara married Richard under great duress because he told her he'd hurt her family if she didn't. But she held on to some hope that his violence could be tempered. "I thought I could change him, but he was a jealous, jealous man," she recalled. "I knew if I tried to escape, he would hunt me down and tear me limb from limb." They had 3 children together, Merrick, Kristen, and Dwayne. And, from the outside, they appeared to live an idyllic suburban life. They went to church every Sunday, where Richard served as an usher and hosted weekend barbecues. Barbara has claimed that she didn't know where her husband's money came from, but it allowed them to buy a nice house with a pool and luxuries like a new TV and car. "I'll be the first one to say, maybe I was naive because I never saw anything illegal," she stated. But Barbara certainly saw Richard's violent side. Though she claims he never hit their children, he certainly abused her. He allegedly broke her nose 3 times, once tried to run her down with a car, and often woke her up in the middle of the night by holding a pillow over her face and threatening to kill her. Meanwhile, he presented himself as a loving husband to their neighbors, who never suspected a thing. "They thought he was great," Barbara said. "Everybody that met him thought I was the luckiest person in the world. The flower truck there once a week. I had new jewelry. He bought me a $12,000 raccoon coat." This illusion, however, was shattered in 1986. Shortly before Christmas in 1986, Richard and Barbara Kuklinski piled into their car and set out to grab breakfast nearby. But before they could get very far, police suddenly surrounded them. As officers swarmed Richard at gunpoint, one threw Barbara onto the ground. Soon thereafter, a detective told her what was going on. "He's a murderer." Barbara Kuklinski had little difficulty believing it. Her husband was charged with 5 murders. He was found guilty of 4 of them, and later convicted of 1 more. While in prison, Richard Kuklinski claimed that he'd killed more than 200 people, though many investigators believe Richard, who had a reputation for grandiosity, greatly exaggerated these numbers. Richard died on March 5, 2006, while serving out his consecutive life sentences. Barbara claimed that his last words were about how much he loved her. For her part, she regrets that she didn't tell him what a bastard he is, and how much I hate him. She added, "I wish the last words he'd heard had been how much I hated his guts." With that, Barbara Kuklinski's nightmare was over. But she was left with scars, both physical and psychological. And the story of Richard Kuklinski's double life is haunting to this day. Indeed, perhaps the most frightening thing about the story of Richard and Barbara Kuklinski is just how normal they seemed from the outside. No one who knew them guessed that Richard was beating his wife, or that he was a violent killer with countless victims. "We were the perfect all-American family," Barbara said. "We were so perfect it would make you sick. The way we lived was surreal." On June 24, 2002, Cara Robinson was helping a friend with chores outside a South Carolina home when a strange man approached her. After making small talk for a few moments, he pulled out a gun and forced the 15-year-old girl into a storage bin in the back seat of his car. He took Robinson to his apartment, where she endured 18 hours of assault. However, early the next morning, the teen managed to sneak out while her attacker slept and contact the police. Later, Robinson would discover that she'd had a near-fatal run-in with Richard Evanitz. He'd previously murdered at least 3 other girls, and had Robinson not escaped, she likely would have been next. In the summer of 2002, Cara Robinson of Richland County, South Carolina, was 15 years old. While school was out, she was spending her days with her friends and boyfriend, and on June 24th, she made plans to hang out at a nearby lake. Robinson first went to her friend Heather's house in West Columbia, where she offered to help with chores so they could leave for the lake sooner. She was watering plants on the front lawn while Heather showered when a dark green Pontiac Trans Am drove past the home before turning around and pulling into the driveway. At first, Robinson suspected that the driver was coming to visit Heather's mother. A man wearing a baseball cap, button-up shirt, and jeans got out of the car, holding a binder full of magazines. He asked her who owned the home. "This is my friend's house, actually," she told him, according to a 2022 article. "What about her parents? Are they home?" the stranger asked. Robinson said that her friend's mom was not home, so the man offered to leave the magazines with the teen. However, when Robinson approached him to grab them, she felt something press into her neck. The cold metal of a gun. "Why don't you come with me?" the man asked her before walking her to his car and forcing her into a plastic container in the back seat. Robinson complied without complaint, and when the car pulled out of the driveway, she immediately went into planning mode, telling herself, Stay calm, gather information, escape. At the time, she did not know that she had just been kidnapped by serial killer Richard Evanitz, who had already killed at least 3 young girls. Regardless of who her captor was, Cara Robinson wasn't planning to go down without a fight. After Richard Evanitz forced Robinson into his vehicle, he started driving toward his apartment. In the back seat, Robinson memorized the serial number on the container she was in, as well as the type of cigarettes her abductor smoked, and the music he listened to. She hoped any bit of information she could collect would eventually help her. When they arrived at Evanitz's complex, he quickly gagged and restrained Robinson before carrying her inside, still in the storage bin. "In that apartment, I knew what this man's intentions were for me," Robinson said. Over the next 18 hours, Evanitz drugged and sexually assaulted the teenager. "I decided sometime during those 18 hours that I would never just be the girl who was raped, and that I also wasn't willing to let this man decide my fate. I continued to remain calm and gather information about my captor," Robinson said. She memorized magnets on his fridge and even read his mail in between assaults. She asked him questions and offered to help clean the apartment. During these interactions, Robinson discovered that Evanitz had been in the U.S. Navy. Eventually, Evanitz gave her more drugs and restrained her with handcuffs and rope in his bed. She fell asleep beside him. In the early morning hours of June 25th, Robinson awoke to find Evanitz sleeping. Using her teeth, she was able to free herself from the restraints and quietly slip out of the room and through the front door. She quickly flagged down a car in the parking lot of the apartment complex and asked the men inside to drive her to the police station. "My name is Cara Robinson. I was kidnapped and just escaped from that apartment," she told them. Robinson had bravely freed herself from the clutches of a murderer. At the Richland County Sheriff's Department, Cara Robinson relayed her horrifying experience to the police. She gave them enough information to allow them to create a photo lineup. While receiving treatment in the hospital, Robinson identified him as her attacker. Officers immediately rushed to his apartment to make an arrest, but by the time they arrived, he was long gone. The authorities ultimately tracked Evanitz down in Florida, where he led them on a high-speed chase. He shot himself after wrecking his car, leaving Robinson and the loved ones of his previous victims without justice. "My immediate reaction was anger," Robinson wrote. "I wanted him to see me across a courtroom and know that I was his downfall, that the girl he took as a victim of opportunity was his biggest mistake. I wanted redemption." However, Robinson's escape allowed the authorities to connect Evanitz to the deaths of 3 girls in Virginia, Sophia Silva and young sisters Kristen and Katie Lisk. Without Robinson's bold actions, their murders may have forever remained unsolved. Cara Robinson also channeled her anger into a career helping other victims of traumatic crimes. Following her attack, Robinson returned home to her family and tried to put the events behind her. But the trauma she experienced ultimately took a toll on her and her parents. "Cara used to be very affectionate. The child I got back was not huggy, not kissy," said Robinson's mom, Deborah Johnson. That was her coping mechanism, but it was beyond devastating. Although Robinson rarely discussed her experience, she ultimately decided to pursue a career in law enforcement and victim advocacy. During college, she began working in the DNA lab at the Richland County Sheriff's Department and later attended the police academy. As an officer, Robinson often worked on sexual assault and child abuse cases. She eventually got married and had children, which changed the course of her life forever. "When I became a mother, all of that changed," Robinson wrote. "My strength reached its limit and I could no longer compartmentalize and shut down my emotions. I had to begin learning how I was impacted and how I could heal. I started using exercise and other somatic processing tools to process my emotions and heal my trauma." Robinson then decided to meet with other victims of kidnapping and sexual assault, including Elizabeth Smart, who had been abducted by Brian David Mitchell when she was 14 years old, just weeks before Robinson's ordeal. I sat down on a couch with Elizabeth and 5 other women who had survived kidnappings and sexual assaults. And that was the moment that I realized that I really had a bigger purpose, Robinson said. Today, Robinson is a motivational speaker and the host of a successful podcast titled Survivor's Guide to True Crime, which delves into stories told by survivors of violent crimes. I knew that I could find a reason for what happened, said Robinson. And I always knew that what happened to me was something that happened so that I could help other people. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe to stay tuned with the latest uploads.